Very happy to be with each of you here this morning. Once again, a very important topic here. We're going to be discussing the diet for the last generation. You know, when we think about diet is something really important for all of us. Science is obviously coming a little bit closer to the idea of vegetarianism. It's quite more popular than when I was young. When I was young, it was a very strange thing. They didn't expect us to even be able to live without being a vegetarian, much less to think about that as a lifestyle. When we think about the Bible, is God concerned with our health? You know, in 3 John, we find there that the apostle is writing there, "Beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health as thy soul prospereth." A lot of times in the religious world, health is separated from religion. A lot of times I've discussed issues over the years, and to them, religion is one thing, health is just a chance. It has nothing to do with what you do. It's just whether God gives it to you or not. When we look at Apostle Paul in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, he talks about holiness. He talks about a sanctified life. It's interesting here, it says, "And the very God of peace sanctify you wholly. And I pray God your whole spirit and soul and body be preserved blameless unto the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ." It's interesting how he puts all these things together. Spiritual, the soul, the body. Okay, these are all connected one with another. Why is that connection there? Why is the body involved in this spiritual declaration? Why is that? In the book This Day with God, it says the condition of the body affects the condition of the soul. Now here in the PowerPoint, I'm only using just the statements that are just the necessary part. Later on, we'll give you the booklet here, Diet for the Last Generation, which gives you more, all of it there, and more statements as well. But clearly here, when we talk about our physical body itself, there is a direct relationship between the body, the physical body, and our spirituality. One affects the other. And we'll see that as we go along. So what I'd like to talk about this morning is the process of restoration. What God is trying to do with all of us to bring us back to the original. In Acts chapter 3, verse 20 to 21, says, "And he shall send Jesus Christ, which before was preached unto you, whom the heavens must receive until the times of restitution of all things, which God hath spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began." We find here that there is a time of restoration. And heaven will keep Jesus there until that time comes. Now, associated with the restoration of the future kingdom, there is also things that need to be restored here on earth as well, especially among God's people. We find that God tried this process of restoration in the times of Jeremiah. Way back then, in Jeremiah 6, verse 16, it says, "Thus saith the Lord, stand ye in the ways, and see and ask for the old paths, where is the good way, and walk therein, and ye shall find rest unto your souls." We remember in the New Testament, Jesus says, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And then he talks about taking his yoke, and he says, "Ye shall find rest for your souls." The same principle was in the Old Testament. And instead of using the same words that Jesus had in the New, Jesus used different words, but the meaning is the same. And that means to find the old paths, and you shall find rest for your souls. If we want spiritual rest, we need to go to the old paths. We need to go back to that. Unfortunately, the Jews, as a people, they kept repeating it over and over again, and they said, "We will not walk therein." They chose not to do that. Since we're talking here about diet, specifically our topic is limited to that, we look at the old paths in regards to diet, that we can find rest for our souls. And we have to go to the very beginning. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 29, And God said, behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth. And every tree in which is the fruit of the tree yielding seed to you, it shall be for meat or for food. We look at the very original diet that God gave to us. That diet was a fruitarian diet, actually. It was specifically designed for the human being. And we look at animal food was not part of God's original plan. Neither when we're looking at us physiologically, we're not designed, we're not a carnivorous type of a being. We're clearly designed to be a plant-based dietary being. Even when sin entered the world, after Adam and Eve sinned, God introduced another aspect to their diet. And that is found in Genesis 3, verse 18. And he says, thou shalt eat the herb of the field. That was a change in their dietary habits. When we look at animal food, for nearly the first millennia and a half, the diet given to mankind was specifically a vegetarian diet. We look at the world's history of just a little bit over 6,000 years. And for a millennia and a half, this was the diet that God gave to mankind. It was only after the flood that he permitted certain animal foods to be eaten. If we compare the Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, we find a direct relationship to when animal food was introduced to the length of lifespan that they had. So here I have a chart here. I try to put it all on one page, so it's a little bit small. But you have here the names of the different generations in Genesis chapter 5 and the ages that they lived. Obviously, Enoch we put here, but that's when he was translated. He never did die, so it wouldn't be fair to put his entire length, but he was translated at 365. But you look here, basically the lifespan, and kind of here is the average here. An average, again, only because of Enoch and Lamech, who died probably the year of the flood. Right after the flood, if we look at the next 10 generations there, starting at 600, Shem, immediately it was cut to 600, and you can see the lifespan right here coming right down all the way to the time of Abraham at 175. Now, why was their life cut short? Why was the previous one here, the previous picture here, you can look at, if we don't include Enoch, you're looking at almost, all of them lived at 900 except Lamech. He died the year of the flood. But the rest of them here, the average there was 900 something years. And the very next one, you look at the dropping down from 900 immediately to 600, all the way down to 175 within the 10 generations. What was the reason for that? And it's directly attributed to their dietary change. In the Paulson collection, it says there, the plan was not for one animal to destroy another animal for food. After the fall, the eating of flesh was suffered in order to shorten the period of the existence of the long-lived race. So here the reason, the specific reason that God permitted flesh food was to shorten the lifespan, going from 900 back down to something shorter than that. And another reason here, when we look at the original reason for the introduction of animal food, it says it was allowed because of what? Because of the hardness of the hearts of men. That's the reason it was given. And it reminds me of what Jesus said. It was for the hardness of the heart that Moses gave you this, but from the beginning, it was not so. Okay. And so Jesus constantly brings us back to the original plan. And here, for the hardness of the hearts and to shorten the lifespan of mankind. And then, just briefly, we go to the in the Mosaic books there, in Deuteronomy, you find there the clean and unclean meats that was given there. And before, I think that's chapter 14. But before giving them the clean and unclean meats, he says something interesting in Deuteronomy chapter 12. He says, when the Lord thy God shall enlarge thy border, as he had promised thee, and thou shalt say, I will eat flesh, because thy soul longeth to eat flesh, thou mayest eat flesh whatsoever thy soul lusteth after. So before giving the distinction of clean and unclean meats, and we'll see later on that during the time that he wrote this, they were living on a purely vegetarian diet. He says, when you get to the promised land, and you say what? I will eat flesh. Why? Because thy soul longeth to eat flesh. It's interesting that the word longeth here, it's actually the same word translated in Deuteronomy 5 verse 21 as covet. The same word. It's true that covet is not always used in a bad sense in the Bible. Even in the New Testament it talks about covet earnestly the best gifts. However, it is clearly connected here also to something called sin. That covetousness for something that is not good for you is specifically a sin. And it's interesting that God used that in Deuteronomy chapter 12 in association with the clean and the unclean meats. And in Romans chapter 7 and verse 7, it says, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. Nay, I had not known sin but by the law, for I had not known lust, except the law had said what? Thou shalt not covet. It's connected together. And this is why in Ministry of Healing, looking at that period of time when flesh food was permitted again after the wilderness experience, they were going to go into the promised land, and God says you can eat flesh foods. In Ministry of Healing, it says it was only because of their discontent and their murmurings for the flesh pots of Egypt that animal food was granted them, and this only for a short time. Its use brought disease and death to thousands. And yet when we look at that 40 years in the wilderness, it says here, yet the restrictions to a non-flesh diet was never heartily accepted. So during that time in the wilderness, God gave them a diet, and they never accepted it from their heart. And not only did they not accept it, it says it continued to be a cause of discontent and murmuring, open or secret. So throughout 40 years, murmuring and complaining for what God has done, they were constantly complaining. One of the things they complained about was their diet. And for that reason, it says it was not made permanent. God desired it to be permanent, but it was not made permanent. Why? Because they continually refused it. And this is why in Ezekiel, the whole chapter talks about different issues, including the Sabbath. It says here in verse 24 and 25, after referring to their wilderness experience, it says, because they had not executed my judgments, but had despised my statutes, and had polluted my Sabbaths, and their eyes were after their fathers' idols. Wherefore I gave them also statutes that were not good, and judgments whereby they should not live. So God then gave them laws that were not good. Laws that actually it was, specifically the Spirit of Prophecy mentions, it was laws that were associated with punishment, usually the death penalty. And the death penalty, in some cases, was not necessarily immediate. It was the death penalty ended up also sometimes longer, but they still ended up having the consequences. Associated with that was also that they should eat neither fat nor blood. That was also a requirement there. And the same requirement you find in the New Testament was also to stay away from those things. And I've never eaten meat in my life, so I'm a third generation vegetarian. So I understand from other people who have eat flesh, if you strain all that stuff, it has no taste. So I don't know what it's like, but God made it very clear for them that they were not to eat these things. And we can see clearly the blood is the carrier of all the diseases, and of course heart disease from the fat is very recognizable that it's very dangerous. And God had them, okay, you want to eat flesh foods? All right, you can do it, but let's at least try to minimize the consequences. So no fat, no blood, and then also the specific type of animals they were going to eat. And each of those animals were first-tier consumers. None of them were third-tier consumers where they eat another animal. All of them were primary animals. And still, there were consequences from that. You even saw that in Genesis, when God gave them after the flood the distinction between clean and unclean meats, and yet their lifespan was cut short very quickly. I want to go to another aspect here, and that is in regards to our preparation for the second coming of Jesus Christ. When we look at the whole issue of a non-flesh diet or a plant-based diet, science is clearly coming up with the benefits of that type of a diet today. Even biblically, we can see that that is the benefit that God wants us to have. My question is, how does that relate to our preparation for the second coming of Jesus Christ? Because we are Adventists. We claim that we are preparing for the second coming of Jesus Christ. In the book Christian Temperance and Bible Hygiene, it talks to us about that. It says, again and again, I have been shown that God is trying to lead us back step by step to his original design, that man should subsist upon the natural products of the earth. That's what God has been trying to do with Adventism as we're preparing for the second coming of Christ. He's trying to get us back to the original diet. That's what he's trying to do. Because when we go to heaven, we read many verses there that even the animals are not going to eat other animals. It's not going to happen anymore. And he's trying to prepare us for that. And this is why it says, among those who are waiting for the coming of the Lord, meat eating will eventually be done away. Flesh will cease to form a part of their diet. So those who are waiting for the coming of the Lord, this is going to happen. It's going to change. Their dietary thing is going to change. Flesh will cease to form a part of their diet. And when we look at this, we should ever keep this end in view and endeavor to work steadily towards it. So there's a process here involved. And this process here in preparing a people for the coming of Christ, preparing the people for a land where there is not going to be meat eating. That's clear. That's not going to happen in the new earth. We're not going to be going out there looking to eat animals. The dietary changes will clearly happen. And so we need to keep that end in view. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, as Apostle Paul, he introduces the people in the wilderness. Verse 1, it starts with the Hebrew people leaving Egypt and going through the Red Sea. And then it goes through and explains some of their problems there, and especially that they were murmuring and complaining in the wilderness. And I think it's in verse 6. It says there that we are not to lust after evil things as they lusted after. That means that we need to look at their experience. And the reason we need to look at their experience, we find in verse 11. Verse 11 is really interesting. After going through the wilderness experience, it says, now all these things happen unto them for ensamples. So we look at the experience of the Hebrew people in the wilderness. All these things happen as an ensamples, or as the margin says, a type. What is a type? A type is something that prefigures something else. For example, the lamb was a type of Jesus Christ. It prefigured something. And here it says it was a type of what? They are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. I know there are some illustrations that he used for their time. They used the end of the world in their time. They understood that. But this has special meaning for us. We are supposed to be the last generation. We are preparing to be the last generation in this world's history. And here it says that they were a type, especially for those who are living at the end of the world. So we need to look and study that experience. That experience from Egypt, from crossing the Red Sea to the second coming of Christ. And in Great Controversy, it specifically mentions there that the history of the Advent people is specifically the great disappointment in 1844 was our Red Sea experience. You can read that clearly there in Great Controversy. And there's many illustrations that crossing the Jordan is going to be the second coming of Christ, to going into the promised land. So now, when they first came out of Egypt, God gave them flesh. Within a month, they complained about the food. God gave them flesh food. It was only for one night. And then God gave them manna. So God not only took away, so they determined to have flesh foods. God gave it to them one night, and then he gave them something better. And then God took them to Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, they spent nearly a year at Mount Sinai, learning God's ways, learning what God had in store for them. And then they left Mount Sinai and continued on the way to the promised land. But they still wanted the Egyptian way of life. They still had that desire. And so after they leave Mount Sinai, in Numbers chapter 11, they determined to have flesh foods again. They wanted to have flesh meats again. Now, this was quite different than the first time. The first time they got it, God gave it to them for one day. There were no consequences the first time. You know, many people don't realize that quail was given them twice, not once. The first time, there were no consequences at all. But they ended up with a different diet. In Numbers chapter 11, verse 33, it says that while the flesh was yet between their teeth ere it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord smote the people with a very great plague. So we find here that as soon as they ate this, they received a big plague. In Christian Temperance and Bible Hygiene, it says they murmured at God's restrictions and lusted after the flesh pots of Egypt. God gave them, let them have flesh, but it proved a curse to them. What did they have? They determined to have it. God says, fine, go ahead. And it became a curse to them. And as it says in Psalms chapter 78, verse 31, that the wrath of God came upon them and slew the fattest of them and smote down the chosen men of Israel. Again, in Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 1, it says, those who had been the most guilty in their murmurings were slain as soon as they tasted the meat for which they had lusted. So here these individuals, the ones that complained the most, the moment they tasted it, they died. Clearly this was not necessarily a long-term result. I know if I were to eat meat, I'd probably get very sick. I know that my body's not used to it. But I wouldn't die instantly. Here it was shown clearly how God felt about their desires, and they died as soon as they tasted it. And this is why in Psalms chapter 78, describing that when God gave them one thing and they rejected it, it says in Psalm 78, and they sinned yet more. That means in this context, in the children of Israel, in the wilderness, that is considered a sin. And why was that? Why was it? Why was it that not only it was considered sin, but why was it that that generation could not enter the promised land? If we look at it, we find only two that left Egypt that were 20 years old and upward entered the promised land. Why was it that they could not enter in? What is the relationship there? In Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 19, it says, so we see that they could not enter in because of what? Unbelief. In other words, if we study this deeper, we don't have time right now to analyze all of this here, but if we study this deeper, we find that this issue of diet is directly in relationship to the subject of justification by faith. They're directly related to it. And when we find here that they refused to accept God's plan, it was because they lacked what? They lacked faith. And for that reason, they could not enter into the promised land. Now we take a look at our experience today. You know, as I mentioned already, that the Advent people, when we entered the Great Disappointment in 1844, that was our Red Sea experience. And then you go to the future In Patriarchs and Prophets, it talks about entering the promised land as Canaan. When we look at our own experience, we find that the children of Israel spent 40 years in that time frame. We, in Adventism, we have been in there for how long? A lot more than 40 years. Even our own experience as a Reformed movement, it's been 100 years, more than 100 years that we've existed. So all of us are in this boat together. And why aren't we in the promised land? Why is it that today that we're still not in Canaan land? Why is it that we're still here? In Selected Messages, Volume 1, page 69, it says, for 40 years did unbelief, murmuring, and rebellion shut out ancient Israel from the land of Canaan. And I want you to pay attention to this. The same sins have delayed the entrance of modern Israel into heavenly Canaan. It's not because the world is not bad enough. It's not because of all these things. It's because of us. And we need to understand that. The same sins that the Israelites struggled in the wilderness, the same sins are delaying us today of entering into the promised land. And so this is why 1 Corinthians 10 is so important. They are clearly a type of the last generation. Those sins, we have to really study what they were struggling with. Those are the same thing we're going to be struggling with today. And we're going to have the same results. The same thing's going to happen to us today as happened to them. And I don't know about you, but I really want to go home. I really want to go home. And I'm not talking about wherever we come from. Obviously, I'm going next week to Australia. My wife still hasn't been able to move here, so I'm really eager to go back there. But that's not home. Different places may be nice, but that's not home. Home is another place, and I want to go home. I like visiting new people. I like when I get there. I hate traveling to get there, but I love meeting new people and sharing the gospel message. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in the Urals in eastern Russia. And it's wonderful to be there, but I want to go home. I'm tired of all this stuff. And brethren, we need to understand this principle here for all of us. And when we look at the experience of the children of Israel, when they rejected God's plan on all these issues, in Psalms 106, there was a direct correlation between what they were doing physically and their spiritual life. It says they lusted exceedingly in the wilderness and tempted God in the desert, and he gave them their request, but what? Sent leanness into their souls. So clearly, the spiritual relationship, we can see that. Now, I want to spend a bit more time here on the subject of it being a test of fellowship, because I think that quite a few people can understand that this is beneficial and all that. But should we as a church make it a test of fellowship? That's a question that we need to evaluate here. Clearly, when you look at the experience of the children of Israel in the wilderness, it was a test of fellowship. When you look at those who determined to have flesh food, what happened? They were disfellowship in their method. And how were they disfellowship with their method? They died. They were in the wilderness. There were many penalties. And what was the penalty? Either stoning, or in this case, as soon as they tasted that food, they died. Others had other consequences, but clearly spiritually, they all suffered the loss. Now, since we are they were a type of God's last day people in preparation for the second coming of Christ, we expect it to be the same thing among God's people before Jesus comes. In Counsels on Diet and Food, page 382, it says, greater reform should be seen among the people who claim to be looking for the soon appearing of Christ. Health reform is to do among our people a work which it has not yet done. That means there is a work that it is to do. And I don't have it here, but in the notes there, one of the things it needs to do, there are two reasons that God gave health reform. One is to lessen suffering in the world, and you find this in Counsel on Diet and Food, and the other is to purify God's people. Two things that it is to do among God's people. So it is not done a work that is, health reform is to do among our people a work which it has not yet done. There are those who ought to be awake to the danger of meat eating, who are still eating the flesh of animals, thus endangering the physical, mental, and spiritual health. Notice here, we're still doing this. What is it? Physical, mental, and spiritual health. Many who are now only half converted on the question of meat eating will go out from God's people and walk no more with it. Clearly, the result eventually is going to be a point of separation, eventually among them. So now, with all these statements like this, we then question the statement in Volume 9, Testings for the Church, where it says we are not to make the use of flesh food a test of fellowship. But we should consider the influence that professed believers who have, but we should consider the influence that professed believers who use flesh foods have over others. Now this seems like a clear statement, but I'd like us to go to the background of this statement first of all. Why did she make this statement? What did she intend to go before this statement was written? What was the response of the brethren? And then I would like to look at prophecy. What has God inspired her to prophesy about the future? So going back a bit, about a year earlier from this statement, we find a statement in the Spalding and McGann collection. The original article that later on became modified, she changed certain things in the original article, and then, of course, it was presented to the General Conference session, I think it was 1909. But the original article wrote this way: "Who among our brethren will sign a pledge to dispense with flesh meats, tea and coffee, and all injurious foods, and become health reformers in the fullest sense of the term?" So this was her question there. She was asking for a pledge to be made. Now, we're not going to talk about tea, coffee, and other injurious foods. Our focus is on something else at this time, and I'm going to try to limit it to that. So who is going to do that? Now, when we look at what God wants to do, God is not drastic. With the children of Israel, when they left Egypt, he didn't sit there and cut them off immediately. They obviously had some of their own food that they brought from Egypt for a while. And then he gave them the flesh foods. And then he introduced them to something better. And then he spent time training them and preparing for the future. So God has a process on how this is to be done. But clearly, under divine inspiration, that process includes making a pledge. And so the process starts with leadership. It never starts with members, or in this case, new members, because when we're talking about a test of fellowship, we're talking about new members coming in. You can't sit here and make a test of fellowship for new members if leaders are still having a difficulty with that point. And this is why, again, still there in the Spalding and McGann collection, it says, "Let the good work begin at Washington and go forth from there to other places." I know whereof I am writing. "If a temperance pledge providing for the abstinence from flesh foods, tea and coffee, and some other foods that are known to be injurious, were circulated through our ranks, a great and good work would be accomplished. I ask you at this time, will you not circulate such a pledge?" Now, she's not talking here, circulating a pledge in the beginning through the entire membership. It's not what she's talking about here. But it is to begin somewhere. Where is it to begin? And she's writing to the headquarters. That's where she is writing at. And I know years ago, even when I moved to Maryland, the outlying areas were considered Washington, D.C. as well. So I was living in Temple Hills at the time, and the address you could put there is Washington, D.C., and it'll come there as well. And then while I was living there, it changed. Okay, so Washington, it was considered an entire area at that time. And so here, we're talking here about leadership, that it needs to begin in the leadership. It must begin at the leadership. And then from there, go to other places. That was the initial plan. It goes on, I'm not going to read here. You can read it in the book there. It then goes to the ministry. It needs to go to all the ministry next. It can't, again, you can't go and expect the membership to do what the ministry still isn't doing. And then it's to go to the educational institutions. It says here, I've been instructed that the students in our schools are not to be served with flesh foods or with food preparations that will cause disturbance of the stomach. But what was the result? When this letter went out, the first result, we can find this in the Ellen G. White biography in volume 6. Elder Daniels, when he read it, he had some concerns. He says, the point that perplexes me is the suggestion to circulate a temperance pledge which includes abstinence from flesh foods and some other foods known to be injurious. So he wrote immediately to Sister White, and he requested not to distribute that pledge, that statement right away. And so he had a meeting with Sister White, and it records the result of that meeting on the same page as there. The results there, the conclusion, he says, the conclusion reached by our study was that an extensive, well-balanced educational work should be carried on by physicians and ministers instead of entering precipitously upon an anti-meat pledge campaign. So after meeting with Sister White, they came to an agreement. This would have been 1908, 1909, something of that nature, that well over 100 years ago, that an extensive, well-balanced educational work should be carried and not entering precipitously upon an anti-meat pledge campaign. Then it goes on. There was a clear understanding arrived at, and Sister White thereafter treated me and the whole matter according to that understanding. And now it goes on. Now it seems to me that we should do a lot of careful preparation in the way of teaching before we press the signing of the pledge. So the agreement was what? First of all, do an extensive work of training and teaching, and then what? And then the pledge would come. It would come out as a result. It would eventually come to that. So the question that I have, and again, I'm not going through the entire details here, but does that mean that it should never circulate the pledge, or the statement that we read earlier, we're not to make a use of flesh for the test of fellowship, does it mean that we should never make flesh eating a test of fellowship? Now, again, we are not proposing that people have a test of fellowship prematurely. For us as a Reformed movement, it's a little bit different, because right from the very beginning of our movement, all of our members were vegetarians. All General Conference officers were all vegetarians. And so we could make it a test, because we were already up to that point. In volume 9, reading the same, because this is in page 159 to 160 here, and on the same pages, there's another statement. It goes on, shall we not bear a decided testimony against the indulgence of perverted appetites? Will any who are ministers of the gospel, proclaiming the most solemn truth ever given to mortals, set an example in returning to the flesh pots of Egypt? So she's talking here, first of all, about the new members, to making it a test of fellowship. And then she talks about the ministry here. And it's questioning, will any who are what? Ministers of the gospel set an example by returning to the flesh pots of Egypt? Will those who are supported by the tithe, those who are receiving income from the tithe, will those who are supported by the tithe from God's storehouse permit themselves by self-indulgence to poison the life-giving current flowing through their veins? Are they going to do that? So yes, okay, she came to agreement. Yes, we will not to make it a test of fellowship, but let's start with those who are in the ministry. Let's start with those who are receiving tithe money. Are they going to do this? And why is it that it's so important that the ministry be the first to do this? Notice here it goes on. Erroneous eating and drinking result in erroneous thinking and acting. We're looking at important issues today. We're faced with crisis after crisis on the world field. And how are we going to make right decisions How are we going to be able to make decisions in accordance with God's will if flesh food is still being eaten? And not just flesh food, obviously. It's talking about more than that. It's not just limiting it to flesh foods here. How can we do that and still represent the message to the world? And then it goes on in the same statement. It says the gospel must be preached to the poor, but the time has not yet come to prescribe the strictest diet. And actually, if you look at the context, it's actually talking about a vegan diet. Right back then. So let's look at prophecy. Let's look at what is God's plan for his church. We see 1909, it was not time yet to prescribe the strictest diet. Clearly not to make it a test of fellowship at that point. What about the future? Is there a time that something should happen? In the year 1884, she writes, if meat is discarded, if the taste is not educated in that direction, if a liking for fruits and grains is encouraged, it will soon be as God in the beginning designed it should be. No meat will be used by his people. I know she received a vision back in 1863. And she became a vegetarian, but occasionally she ate meat. That was until she went to Australia. And you'll see clearly there, when they had a Brighton camp meeting, she mentioned specifically it was the Brighton camp meeting that made a distinction. After that, she saw things in vision, and she says, no more meat. And she forbid it off her table. Not going to happen anymore. Not at my table. This is not going to happen. And again, the statements I have there in the booklet there. But here it says, if 1884, if we start this way, soon it will be what? No meat will be used, not by individuals only, but what? By his people. Again, 1890, we read this a little bit earlier. Again and again, I have been shown that God is trying to lead us back step by step to his original design. That men should subsist upon the natural products of the earth. Among those who are waiting for the coming of the Lord, meat eating will eventually be done away. Flesh will cease to form a part of their diet. So instead of trying to figure out how we can still keep eating flesh foods, it says here, the light given me is that it will not be very long before we shall have to give up using any animal food. So does that mean we give up meat eating altogether? Does that mean we have to, as a people, give up flesh foods? Again, 1884, this is a prophecy. And I believe this, that she was inspired by God to give these prophecies. The question is, you may ask, would you do away entirely with meat eating? That's an important question. And notice the answer. I answer, it will eventually come to this. But we are not prepared for this step just now. Meat eating will eventually be done away. So here's a prophecy here. Clearly, not ready for it yet. We're not prepared for this step right now. This is not where we're at. We have some work to do. And clearly the work starts in leadership, ministry, church members. Yeah, that's the process that it goes through. And then, but eventually, because we are preparing for another world. We're not preparing to live here. We're not preparing to live in this environment. We're preparing to go to a place where even the lion is not going to eat flesh of animals. That's what we're going to. We're going to a completely different environment. A place of peace, not of animal killing of animals. And for that reason, well, I want to read it again. You may ask, would you do away entirely with meat eating? I answer, it will eventually come to this. But we are not prepared for this step just now. Meat eating will eventually be done away. So although in volume 9 it was not time, we cannot deny from these statements that eventually it will come to this. So just to summarize all of this about the time, specifically about the timing. Again, in Counsels on Diet and Food. We want the pervading truth of God's Word to get hold of every one of our people before this conference is over. And she's addressing the 1901 General Conference session. We want them to understand that the flesh of animals is not the proper food for them to eat. And if you read the history there, Dr. Kellogg, actually in 1901, he rented a house in Washington, D.C. He rented a house there and invited delegates to come and eat vegetarian food to say, well, it can be done. They were not even clear on it, so he went and did that just so they can understand how this is practical, how this can be done. And this is why she's addressing the delegation, that you need to understand something. In this environment, you cannot make it a test of fellowship. That's why it needs to begin with us. That's why it needs to begin with the ministry. For those of us who are leading the people of God, we need to understand this clearly and in order for them to help them out. And now, the next delegation session in 1903, because of the appeals she made in 1901, and then things haven't changed. In 1903, she makes it very clear. God gave the light on health reform. And those who rejected it, rejected God. This is a serious statement. And the context, again, they were attacking Kellogg on this. And she says, it wasn't Kellogg. It wasn't his light. It's light that came from God. And we need to respect what God has given to us. Again, in Spalding and McGann collection. It says, in this experience of backsliding from the principles of health reform, our people have been repeating the history of the children of Israel in the wilderness during their 40 years of travel. So we find there that they came forward, they were improving on health message, and then they backslid. And she says, look, this is no different than the history of Israel. And this is why that wilderness experience is so important. It's a type of God's people in the last days. It says those who continue to follow their own course in this respect, eating and drinking as they please, will gradually go careless of the instructions of the Lord regarding other phases of the present truth. They will surely reap as they have sown. What happens if our dietary principles are not held up to where it should be? What happens if we backslide? What is going to happen? It's going to affect us not only on the physical health, it's going to affect our theology. The natural result, it will make us grow careless. It's not going to even make us say, okay, let's reject these truths. But what does it do? It makes us go careless on the other phases of the present truth. So, how will we know that we have truly accepted the third angel's message? What is one of the factors, one of the things you can look at? In volume 6 it says, when the third angel's message is received in its fullness, health reform will be given its place in the councils of the conference, in the work of the church, in the home, at the table, and in all the household arrangements. Then the right arm will serve and protect the body. So one of the things they can look at is to understand if the third angel's message is really reaching us, we're going to see it in how health reform is being treated. Now we may ask, does that mean in all parts of the world? Again, here's a prophecy. The Lord will teach many in where? In all parts of the world to combine fruits, grains, and vegetables into foods that will sustain life and will not bring disease. Here, God will teach people. God is not limited. We may not understand it, but God is not limited. It is His design that the food treasuries of each country shall be so prepared that they can be used in the countries for which they are suited. As God gave manna from heaven to sustain the children of Israel, so He will now give His people in different places skill and wisdom to use the productions of these countries in preparing foods to take the place of meat. This is a really important statement. Again, combining back to the Hebrew experience, they received manna. We're not going to receive manna, but we're going to have wisdom where? In all parts of the world. And sorry, this statement is not in the booklet. So this statement was added a little bit later on. God is going to give us that wisdom. And that's why the pot of manna is so important for us. The experience there is so important for us in this last generation. So let's go back to the issue of justification by faith. It's quite interesting, the statement here in Faith and Works. In order for man to be justified by faith, faith must reach a point where it will control the affections and impulses of the heart. And it is by obedience that faith itself is made perfect. Notice here, when we're talking about justification by faith, we're not talking about just something separated from us. Genuine justification by faith changes our nature. It changes our affections and the impulses of the heart. And it is for this reason, when we truly understand the subject of justification by faith. I love this statement here in Notebook Leaflets, where it says, true conversion to the message of present truth embraces conversion to the principles of health reform. That means when we're talking about justification by faith, it changes our nature. We're not teaching that you must be a health reformer and then you'll be a Christian. No, absolutely not. What we're saying is that when you accept justification by faith through the blood of Jesus Christ, He changes our nature, and as a result, this embraces the principles of health reform. And that's what God is looking for in these last days. God is looking for a changed people to prepare for the second coming of Christ. And He gives us the process here. The process, it's not all at once. Here's the process to go through it. And it'll help us to have a clear understanding of the message so that we can prepare for the earth made new. And I'm looking forward to going home. May God help each one of us. Amen.
Amen.